In the English city of Leicester, there is a completely ordinary municipal parking lot. Faded painted lines, cracked asphalt. Every morning, commuters parked their cars and walked across it, never suspecting they were stepping over a grave. Beneath that asphalt lay a king, struck down in battle in 1485, stripped naked, paraded through the streets, and dumped in a hole dug too short for his body. Then he was erased twice, once by demolition, once by propaganda. For 5 centuries, the questions multiplied. Why did one historian insist he was under this exact car park? Why did a twisted spine silence a 400-year-old play? And why did a furniture maker's cheek swab change everything? Solved. With proof. To understand what was buried under that parking lot, you have to go back to a single morning in August 1485. The place is Bosworth Field, a stretch of English countryside about to become the graveyard of a dynasty. On one side stands King Richard III, the last ruler of the Plantagenet line, a royal house that had held the English throne for over 300 years. On the other side stands Henry Tudor, a challenger with an army, a claim, and everything to prove. By the end of that day, one of them would be king. The other would be a corpse. The battle turned against Richard. Somewhere in the chaos, he lost his helmet. And the chronicles record what happened next with brutal clarity. Enemy foot soldiers swarmed him, striking blow after blow at his unprotected head until the last Plantagenet king fell dead in the mud. He was the last English king ever to die in combat. But death was only the beginning of what was done to him. The victors stripped his body naked. They slung him over the back of a horse like a sack of grain and paraded him through the streets of Leicester so that every citizen could see what had become of their king. And then came the final insult. His body was handed to a local monastery, the Greyfriars, and lowered into a hastily dug grave. The hole was too short for him. There was no coffin. There was no shroud. There was barely a ceremony. The man who had worn the crown of England was disposed of the way you dispose of an enemy you despise. And that, you might think, would be the end of the story. It was not even the beginning. Because Richard III was about to be erased. Twice. The first erasure was physical. Decades after the battle, England tore itself away from the Catholic Church in the upheaval known as the Reformation. Monasteries across the country were dissolved, and Greyfriars was obliterated. Its stones were carted away for other buildings. Its land was sold, divided, and built over. And somewhere in that demolition, something quietly catastrophic happened. The location of the king's grave simply vanished from human memory. No marker, no map, no record precise enough to follow. Within a few generations, nobody on earth could point to the spot where Richard III lay. A king of England was lost. The second erasure was far more deliberate. The Tudor dynasty now held the crown, but they held it by conquest, and their claim by blood was dangerously thin. A dynasty built on a battlefield needs something more durable than luck. It needs a story. And the story they chose was simple. The old king had to become a monster. Tudor writers went to work on the dead man's reputation, and then the greatest writer of them all finished the job. William Shakespeare, working under a Tudor queen, immortalized Richard III as a venomous, hunchbacked villain, a creature twisted in body and soul, a tyrant who murdered his own nephews, the young princes in the Tower, simply to steal a crown. The play was a masterpiece. It was performed for centuries, and slowly, theater hardened into history. For 400 years, if you asked anyone in the English-speaking world about Richard III, you received the same confident answer. The hunchback, the monster, the child killer. Now pause on what had actually been accomplished here. This is not history drifting into legend by accident. This is a documented operation, a political machine turning a defeated enemy into a demon, because the new dynasty's survival depended on it. The victors did not just take Richard's crown. They took his grave, and then they took his humanity. Both erasures held for 500 years. The bones stayed lost. The caricature stayed king. And the two crimes protected each other perfectly, because you cannot examine a body you cannot find, and you cannot question a story when the only witness is missing. Until one historian, armed with old maps and an obsession nobody shared, became convinced that both erasures could be reversed. She believed she knew exactly where the lost king was lying, and nearly everyone who heard her theory told her she was chasing a fantasy. Her name was Philippa Langley, and she was not a professor with a laboratory or a university behind her. She was an independent historian, a screenwriter researching a project about Richard III, who had fallen down a rabbit hole that would consume years of her life. Langley refused to accept that a king of England could simply evaporate. Bodies do not vanish, she reasoned. Graves do not move. The Greyfriars Monastery had been demolished, yes, but demolition does not delete the ground beneath a building. Somewhere under modern Leicester, the friary still existed as a footprint, and somewhere inside that footprint lay a grave. The problem was finding it under a living, breathing city. So Langley did something deceptively simple. She gathered the oldest maps of Leicester she could find, medieval documents showing the friary and its grounds, and she began overlaying them onto the modern street grid, aligning ancient landmarks with present-day roads, matching corner to corner, wall to wall, century to century. It was painstaking, obsessive work. And as the layers stacked up, the footprint of the lost monastery slid into focus over the modern city. The Church of the Greyfriars, the most likely resting place of the king, did not sit under a cathedral or a memorial or anything dignified. It sat under Hothiero, a completely unremarkable municipal parking lot used by the staff of local government offices. Cars, painted lines, asphalt. That was the spot her research kept pointing to, stubbornly, year after year. Now imagine taking that conclusion to the academic establishment. An independent researcher with no excavation to her name, claiming that one of history's most famous missing bodies was lying under a specific car park, and asking for the money to tear up the asphalt and look. The polite word used was unlikely. The less polite word was fantasy. The bones, experts warned, had probably been scattered centuries ago. Some traditions even claimed the king's remains had been dug up during the Reformation and thrown into a river. Langley heard every version of no. She kept going anyway, raising funds, recruiting allies, pushing for years, until finally, the University of Leicester agreed to dig. In August of 2012, an archaeological team arrived at the parking lot. They came armed with ground-penetrating radar, stacks of historical records, and carefully mapped trench plans. This was not a treasure hunt. It was a precision operation, designed to slice through the modern surface and read the medieval layers beneath. The machines cut a neat trench through the hard asphalt, down into the dense, wet clay below. And then something happened that even the optimists on the team struggled to believe. On the very first day of the excavation, in the very first trench, the diggers struck human bone. Leg bones lying in undisturbed soil. The team did the disciplined thing. They covered the remains, continued mapping the site, and confirmed they were inside the church itself, in the choir, exactly where a high-status burial would be placed. Then they returned to those bones and began to excavate in earnest. What emerged from the clay, brushstroke by brushstroke, was designated Skeleton 1, and the grave itself told a story before the bones said a word. It was crude. It was sloppy. It was dug too short for the body it held, forcing the head to prop awkwardly upward against the wall of the pit. There was no trace of a coffin, no shroud fittings, nothing arranged, nothing honored, and the wrists were crossed together in a way that suggested something chilling. They may still have been bound when the body went into the ground. Stop and compare that picture to the Chronicles. A hated enemy, dumped fast into a hole dug carelessly short, hands tied, no ceremony, inside the Greyfriars Church. The grave matched the humiliation of 1485 detail for detail, like a photograph developing under the brush. But archaeologists are trained to resist the story they want to see. A battered skeleton in the right building, in the right kind of grave, is a candidate. It is not a king. To turn skeleton 1 into Richard III, the bones themselves would have to testify, and testify they did. The skeleton was lifted from the clay and transported to the laboratory, where it stopped being an archaeological find and became something closer to a murder victim. Forensic specialists went to work on it with the same methods used in modern criminal investigations. And piece by piece, the bones began to answer questions that had hung in the air for 5 centuries. The first question was the simplest. How old was this man when he died? The answer came from the state of the bones themselves, the fusion of the skeleton, the condition of the joints. This was a man in his early 30s. Richard III was 32 years old when he fell at Bosworth. The first box was ticked. The second question was harder. How did he die? The skull answered that one, and its testimony was horrifying. The forensic team cataloged multiple wounds to the head, injuries delivered by bladed medieval weapons. 2 of them were catastrophic, either one fatal on its own. One blow had sliced away a section of the back of the skull, another had driven upward into the brain, and the pattern of the wounds carried a specific meaning. Injuries like these, clustered and unobstructed, are what happens to a man who has lost his helmet. The chronicles said Richard's helmet came off in the final chaos, and that enemy foot soldiers swarmed him, hacking him down. The skull repeated that account almost word for word, blow after blow to an unprotected head, delivered from multiple angles by multiple attackers until the king was dead. 500 years later, the bones still held the record of every strike. But it was the third finding that made the room fall silent. Because when the specialists assembled the vertebral column, the spine of skeleton 1 did not run straight. It curved, hard, twisting sideways in a dramatic lateral arc. This was not damage from the grave. This was not the soil compressing the bones. This was a medical condition the man had lived with, a textbook case of adolescent onset scoliosis, a curvature that begins around the age of 10 and worsens through the growing years, and this curvature was severe. Reconstruction showed that in life, his right shoulder would have sat visibly higher than his left. The twisting of the spine would have compressed the space inside his chest, pressing on his lungs, likely leaving him in chronic pain for most of his life. Now, hold that finding up against the most famous description of Richard III ever written. Shakespeare's monster. The hunchback, the crooked villain whose twisted body supposedly mirrored a twisted soul. For 400 years, defenders of Richard had insisted the deformity was pure Tudor invention, a lie stitched onto a healthy man. Skeptics had insisted the plays were right all along, and the skeleton revealed that both sides were wrong in the most human way possible. There was no hunchback. There was no withered arm, another detail the propaganda loved. But there was a real spine, with a real, painful, hidden curvature. The caricature was a cruel theatrical exaggeration, but it had been built around a genuine medical truth, twisted and weaponized. And once you see that, the entire picture of Richard III inverts. Because think about what this spine actually means. This was a severely disabled man by any standard, medieval or modern. And this same man trained for war, wore plate armor weighing dozens of pounds, controlled a powerful warhorse in battle, and fought at Bosworth so fiercely that even hostile chroniclers recorded his courage, killing his way toward Henry Tudor himself before he was dragged down. The propaganda painted a coward and a creature. The bones described a man in constant pain who fought like a lion until the moment he died. So the evidence now stood as follows. Right location, inside the lost Greyfriars Church. Right burial, hasty and humiliating, exactly as recorded. Right age, right wounds, right spine. Every circumstantial arrow pointed at one name. But circumstantial is the operative word. Skeletons cannot be cross-examined, and resemblance is not identity. To claim a king with scientific certainty, the team needed the one witness that cannot be bribed, coached, or forged. They needed DNA, pulled from bones that had been soaking in wet clay for 527 years. Extracting DNA from ancient bones is one of the most delicate operations in modern science. Time is merciless to genetic material. 5 centuries in cold, wet clay shatters DNA into fragments, scrambles it, and lets bacteria chew through what remains. And the contamination risk is even crueler. A single stray hair, a fingerprint, a breath from a living technician can flood a sample with modern DNA and ruin the entire sequence. Working with material this old means working in sealed laboratories in full protective suits, treating a medieval skeleton like evidence at an active crime scene. But the scientists had one powerful advantage, and it came from an unexpected direction. Motherhood. Most of your DNA is a shuffled deck, remixed every generation, but one small piece refuses to shuffle. Mitochondrial DNA passes from a mother to every one of her children, intact, generation after generation. Sons carry it but cannot pass it on. Daughters carry it and hand it down again, which means it flows through history along an unbroken chain of mothers, a genetic thread running through the centuries, unchanged except for the rarest mutations. If you could find a living person connected to Richard III through an unbroken female line, their mitochondrial DNA and his should match, 500 years apart. There was just one problem. Richard III left no surviving legitimate children. His only son died before him. The king's own line was a dead end, but his mother's line was not. Richard had an older sister, Anne of York. Anne had a daughter. That daughter had a daughter. And so the search began, one of the most extraordinary feats of genealogical detective work ever attempted. Researchers traced Anne's female line forward through time, mother to daughter, through parish records, wills, marriage documents, and family archives, through 17 generations and 500 years of wars, plagues, and revolutions. One broken link, one missing daughter, one undocumented birth, and the chain would snap. Against all odds, the chain held. It wound its way out of the medieval world, through the centuries, across an ocean and back, and ended at a living human being. His name was Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker working quietly in London, a man who had spent most of his life with no idea that the blood of the House of York ran through his family. Ibsen agreed to help. The sample collection took seconds, a simple cheek swab, and with that swab, the two ends of a 500-year-old thread were finally in the same laboratory. On one bench, the modern DNA of Michael Ibsen. On the other, the fragmented ancient DNA painstakingly recovered from the teeth and bones of skeleton 1. The sequences were processed, aligned, and compared, and the result was a flawless match. Both carried the same rare mitochondrial signature, a lineage known as haplogroup J1C2C, an uncommon genetic marker shared by only a tiny fraction of the population. The furniture maker and the skeleton under the parking lot were maternal relatives, linked mother to mother across 5 centuries. Now assemble the full case, the way the researchers did. A skeleton found in the choir of the lost Greyfriars Church, precisely where a defeated king was recorded buried. A crude, too-short grave, matching a humiliating disposal. A man in his early 30s, dead from battle wounds to an unhelmeted head, a spine curved by severe scoliosis, the seed of the hunchback myth, and now a rare maternal bloodline matching a living descendant of Richard's own sister, traced through 17 unbroken generations. The team ran the statistics on all of it combined. The probability that some random medieval man could tick every one of those boxes by coincidence was vanishingly small, effectively approaching 0. In February 2013, the University of Leicester called a press conference watched around the world and made it official. The skeleton under the parking lot was, beyond reasonable doubt, King Richard III. The lost king was found. The mystery was solved. The team could have stopped right there, taken their place in history, and closed the file. Instead, they decided to run one more test, a final check on the royal bloodline itself, father to son. That test was supposed to be a formality. It detonated instead. To understand the final test, you need to understand what the male bloodline meant to the medieval world. Mitochondrial DNA follows mothers, but there is a mirror image on the other side of the family tree. The Y chromosome passes exclusively from father to son, an unbroken male thread running parallel to the female one. And in medieval England, that male thread was not just biology, it was everything. The entire Plantagenet dynasty, 300 years of kings, rested its claim to the throne on one idea: an unbroken bloodline of fathers and sons stretching back through history. The divine right to rule flowed through that line. The Wars of the Roses, the very conflict that killed Richard, was fought over competing branches of it. Thousands died arguing about whose paternal descent was purer. So the researchers designed an elegant final verification. Richard III and certain living English aristocrats shared, on paper, the same paternal ancestor, King Edward III, Richard's great-great-grandfather. The genealogists tracked down 5 living, documented male line descendants of the Somerset family, men whose family trees traced directly back to Edward III through an unbroken chain of fathers and sons. The logic was simple and beautiful. Same paternal ancestor, same Y chromosome. Richard's ancient Y chromosome, extracted from the parking lot skeleton, should match those living men seamlessly. It was meant to be a formality, one last decorative flourish on an airtight case. The samples were sequenced. The data came back, and the scientists stared at their screens in disbelief. It was a mismatch, not a borderline result, not a partial overlap muddied by degraded DNA. A total, complete, absolute mismatch. Richard's Y chromosome did not match his own royal relatives. Somewhere in the 19 generations of fathers and sons separating Richard III from those living descendants, the male line had been broken. And there is only one way a male line breaks. Genetics has a cold, clinical name for it, a false paternity event. History has older words: adultery, illegitimacy, a secret. At some point in that revered royal family tree, a woman, a queen, or a noblewoman had a child by a man who was not her husband. That child was raised as a true-born royal son, inherited his supposed father's name and blood claim, and passed the counterfeit lineage down through the centuries with no one ever the wiser. A cuckoo had been placed in the most powerful nest in England, and it had worn a crown or stood beside one for generations. The finding was published in the journal Nature Communications in 2014, and its implications reach far beyond one skeleton. Because here is the uncomfortable arithmetic. The break could sit anywhere along those 19 generations. Every single link is a suspect. And depending on where it happened, the consequences change from a footnote into an earthquake. If the false paternity occurred on the Somerset side of the tree, the living descendants branch, then Richard's own blood is untouched, and the secret belongs to another family's past. But if the break happened early, high up in the shared trunk of the tree, the implications are staggering. It would mean Richard III himself was not a biological Plantagenet. It would mean his brother, King Edward IV, was not either. It would mean the princes in the tower, the 2 boys at the heart of history's darkest royal mystery, carried no true Plantagenet blood at all. It would mean the House of York fought a devastating civil war, soaked England in blood for a crown, that by its own sacred logic of descent, it had no genetic right to claim. Thousands of men dying at Bosworth and a dozen battlefields before it, over a bloodline that may have been a biological illusion. The DNA cannot tell us where the secret lies. It can only tell us, with certainty, that the secret exists. Somewhere in England's royal past, hidden behind a wedding portrait and a family crest, there was an affair, and history never found out. And that revelation casts a long shadow over the most infamous accusation ever attached to Richard's name. Because if royal blood could be an illusion, then royal motives deserve a second look. It is time to reopen the case of the princes in the tower. So let us lay out the full verdict, the way a courtroom would. First, the identification. Exhibit 1, the maps. Philippa Langley's overlays pointed to one specific parking lot, and the trench proved the lost Greyfriars Church was exactly there. Exhibit 2, the grave. Crude, too short, no coffin, hands seemingly bound, matching the recorded humiliation of 1485 detail for detail. Exhibit 3, the body. A man in his early 30s, killed by savage blows to an unprotected head, precisely as the chronicles describe Richard's final moments. Exhibit 4, the spine. Severe adolescent onset scoliosis, the hidden truth beneath 4 centuries of hunchback propaganda. And Exhibit 5, the bloodline. A rare maternal signature, haplogroup J1C2C, matching a living descendant of Richard's sister, traced mother to daughter through 17 unbroken generations. 5 independent lines of evidence: maps, grave, wounds, spine, and DNA. None of them depends on the others, and every single one points at the same man. The identification of Richard III is as close to certainty as historical science has ever come. Now, honesty demands a caveat, and it is an important one. The Y chromosome mismatch proves a false paternity event exists somewhere in those 19 generations. It does not tell us where. The break may well sit on the Somerset side of the tree, generations after Richard, leaving his own blood claim completely intact. Science hands down verdicts by weight of evidence, and here the verdict on identity is overwhelming, while the verdict on the royal bloodline remains an open file. But that open file changes something important. It changes how we are allowed to think about the accusation that has defined Richard for 500 years. The princes in the tower. The story we inherited is simple. Richard locked his 2 young nephews, the sons of his brother King Edward IV, in the Tower of London, and had them murdered to steal the crown. Shakespeare carved that version into the world's memory. But walk through the actual sequence of events, and the simple story develops a serious problem. Richard did not take the throne by assassination. He took it through a legal ruling. In 1483, the boys were declared illegitimate on the grounds that their father's marriage was invalid, and that declaration was confirmed by an act of Parliament. Whatever you think of that ruling, its effect was decisive. The princes were legally removed from the succession before Richard was ever crowned. In the cold logic of power, they were already neutralized. Killing them would gain him little, while their deaths on his watch would hand his enemies the perfect weapon. Which raises the question no Tudor playwright ever wanted asked. Who actually needed those boys dead? Follow the motive, and it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Henry Tudor won the crown at Bosworth with a blood claim so weak it was almost decorative. To secure his throne, he married the prince's own sister, Elizabeth of York, and to make her royal enough to strengthen him, he repealed the act that declared her illegitimate. But that repeal cut both ways. The moment the children of Edward IV were legitimate again, her brothers, if they still lived, outranked Henry completely. Every subject in England would know the true king was one of those boys. For Richard, the princes were a contained problem. For Henry, they were an existential threat. He had everything to lose if they surfaced, everything to gain if they quietly ceased to exist, and afterward an entire propaganda machine dedicated to pinning every crime imaginable on the dead king he had replaced. Let us be precise, because precision is the whole point of this story. None of this proves Henry Tudor killed the princes. The evidence does not exist in either direction, but the DNA era has done something the Tudors never anticipated. It has shown that the official history contains at least one enormous lie hidden in the royal bloodline itself. And once you know the pen that wrote the story cannot be trusted, the story's greatest villain deserves a retrial. The 3 questions from the beginning of this story have now been paid in full. The historian was right. The spine was real. And the cheek swab did change everything. History is written by whoever survives to hold the pen. But bones and chromosomes do not read propaganda. The dig beneath that parking lot solved a 500-year disappearance, humanized a disability that had been twisted into a monster myth, and exposed how fragile the idea of pure royal blood always was. In 2015, Richard III was reburied in Leicester Cathedral, 530 years late, carried past crowds lining the streets for a king twice erased and finally recovered. Not a saint, not Shakespeare's villain, a man. The most earth-shattering secrets are not locked in castles or classified archives. They wait under our feet, under the wheels of morning traffic, for the science of the future to dig them up. Like and subscribe. See you in the next exploration.